And the runway's still about 3 miles ahead, 12 o'clock and 3 miles. And the current RVR is 2,000, midpoint 1,800, roll out 1,800.
Honorable fuel, 5 to 90%.
I'm sorry, say it again, you're out of fuel? Still got about 2.5 miles to go. I think that's a low altitude alert. I'll come to 2963. 96 Hill appears you're going left of course now. 96 Hotel, you definitely left of course at this time. You had 200 feet. You see any lights or any roads on there? Showing you 200 feet now. Show you 100 feet now. 96 Hotel, radar contact lost. 96 Hotel.
Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. You just heard audio between JFK Tower and a Cessna 172 that ran out of gas while flying an approach in very low IFR conditions. The pilot and passenger survived, and we'll talk more about that story in the news. Our thanks to liveatc.net for that audio. By the way, if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision jet, or would like flight training in one, there's a whole lot I can do to help you with either one of those. Just call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 106, we talked with Flying Magazine senior editor Rob Mark about several recent VFR and IMC accidents. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. This week in the news, the entire Cirrus SF50 Vision jet fleet was grounded, though some of them are now back in the air, and we'll tell you what happened. And we had the story of a prosthetic leg that fell from the sky into a lumberyard in California. All this and more, and the news starts now. From the NewYorkTimes.com, a small plane carrying 3 people had made 6 attempts to land in the thick fog above New York City and was headed for a 7th attempt before it ran out of fuel above Long Island. The aircraft first clipped the roof of a church, then several power lines, before becoming entangled in the cables like a fly in a web suspended a foot above the front lawn of a brick house. When police arrived, they found the plane dangling from the cables, nose down, hovering as if freeze-framed a second before tragedy. The pilot and 2 passengers, mostly unharmed, were sitting on a nearby curb. The power lines, according to police, likely kept the accident from turning into a deadly disaster. By the following day, the Cessna had been extricated from the power lines and was sitting in the front yard of a house in Valley Stream, a village in Queens. The police identified the 2 passengers. All 3 are from Flushing area of Queens. The 3 men managed to climb out of the plane before emergency workers arrived. The men, officials said, had been traveling a plane they had rented from a flight school and aircraft rental service in Farmingdale, New York. They had flown to Niagara Falls on Sunday, and they were returning and attempting to land the plane at Republic Airport in East Farmingdale. After 4 attempts at the regional airport, the plane was directed to Kennedy, where 2 more attempts were made before running out of gas. Now, I looked at the weather, and it was incredibly low. The visibility was less than a quarter of a mile. And I also took a look at the pilot's certificate, and it's not clear to me that he had an instrument rating. It was rather odd because it showed he had a commercial and a private rating, and it showed that he had a Boeing 737 type rating, but with limitations not permitting him to be a pilot in command. Now, it didn't show an ATP rating, which would have implied an instrument rating. So it wasn't real clear if he was instrument rated. Now, the pilot and his passengers were extremely lucky, as these kinds of accidents usually are fatal, though it does seem that they probably should have looked at the weather early and attempted to go to a different airport rather than try multiple attempts at landing when the airports in that area were all below IFR minimums. From aeronews.net, another interesting story of someone who got lucky. Pilot is safe after landing atop a 60-foot tree in Idaho. 78-year-old pilot of a Piper Cub escaped injury when the plane developed engine problems during a flight in Idaho and settled in the top of a 60-foot-tall giant white fir. The pilot, who was not identified, took off from Challis and was intending to land at the McCall Airport when the engine began to lose power. The county sheriff's department said in a news release that it was notified at 8:19 p.m. of a spot locator beacon activation. First responders used snowmobiles to reach the accident scene. 2 helicopters were also launched, but they were concerned that the rotor wash might dislodge the airplane from the top of the tree. So an experienced hazardous tree expert who works for the McCall Fire Department scaled the tree, limbing the tree as he went up, secured the plane, got the pilot into a safety harness, and lowered him to the ground. He said that it, quote, felt like just another day at work, climbing and limbing a tree. The plane will likely stay in the tree for a week or more before it can be extracted using helicopters. From FlyingMag.com, the FAA grounds all Cirrus Vision jets over an angle of attack issue. The FAA issued an emergency AD against the Cirrus jet that grounded the entire fleet until specific maintenance was performed on the aircraft's angle of attack indicators. The AD was prompted by 3 incidents in which stall warning and protection systems or electronic stability and protection systems engaged when not appropriate, with the first incident occurring in November, the most recent one in April. Elsewhere, I've read that there was a production issue with the angle of attack indicator, which caused it to be loose and hence give inaccurate readings. So the entire fleet was grounded and all AOAs removed from every aircraft. Now, I estimate there are about 120 aircraft in the fleet around the world, of which I read 99 are here in the United States. Just a day or two, I read that almost all of those AOAs have been returned to the manufacturer, are being reworked, and already some of these airplanes are back in the sky. So kudos to the FAA and Cirrus for grounding the fleet. And I should mention that the AOA was manufactured by a company that is different than the supplier of the AOA indicators that have been problematic in the 737 Max aircraft. From AOPA.org, a study shows that accidents are less likely when aircraft are equipped with ADS-B in. The study examined the effect of ADS-B in on general aviation and air taxi accident rates and found a significant reduction in the likelihood of an accident, which decreased by 53% for aircraft equipped with ADS-B in. It also found that the likelihood of a fatal accident decreased by 89% for aircraft with ADS-B in. The paper, which is titled Measured Impact of ADS-B in Applications on General Aviation and Air Taxi Accident Rates, is produced by the Regulus Group, that's REGULUS, and will be presented at the 38th Digital Avionics System Conference in September. Now, they focused on data for 5 years from 2013 to 2017, and they used a fleet method to identify those reductions. They determined the number of ADS-B in-equipped non-air carrier aircraft and compared that to the FAA's fleet forecast for general aviation. Accidents by type involving ADS-B in-equipped aircraft were divided by the number of equipped operations. The data showed aircraft equipped with ADS-B in experience accidents less often. They said, quote, in both the lower 48 and Alaska, aircraft with ADS-B in capable equipment have experienced a reduced accident rate as compared to those without. The analysis does not prove that ADS-B in applications could have prevented the accidents for the unequipped flights. However, the trend is very positive and supports the effectiveness claims made by the program. And here's a related story from avweb.com, satellite ADS-B progressing. It says we're 7 months to the FAA's ADS-B out mandate, but the ground is already shifting with a planned move from a ground-based to a satellite-based system. So-called space-based ADS-B, or SBA, would help fill in coverage areas currently beyond the reach of land-based data transceivers. Announced last year, the concept of moving the data signal from terrestrial to space would promise global seamless surveillance capability, according to the FAA. Quote, SBA may be the next step in the evolution of ADS-B, moving from the current system of ground stations to radios hosted on satellites, enabling surveillance across the entire globe, the FAA said. The administration has set a 1 to 3 year timeline for testing SBA in the Caribbean. The FAA plans to roll out SBA across North American airspace over the next decade and touts the ability to use SBA to supplement ground-based technology in the case of localized outages. From aviationpros.com, a Flagstaff, Arizona engineer has created the Fan Flyer personal aircraft. More than a jetpack, less than a helicopter, the quest for this missing link in personal aircraft prompted a Boeing-sponsored competition with $2 million in prizes and inspired Flagstaff engineer Jim Corning to make his sketches and ideas a reality. Now, more than a year later, a candy red 400-pound mock-up of the Fan Flyer, which is Corning's submission to the Go Fly competition sponsored by Boeing, is in his East Side warehouse. Corning and his teammates test everything from noise levels to fan blade shape, making minute adjustments to a 1/3 scale model and other test systems that could revolutionize the final creation. Fan Flyer's current design features 4 fans surrounded by an open cockpit that can hold a 200-pound pilot. Corning expects the gas-powered vehicle, when it is complete, to have a cruising speed as high as 80 miles per hour and a maximum elevation of 10,000 feet. He envisioned various designs in his free time and assembled a team of employees after he heard of the Go Fly Challenge, which is, quote, seeking safe, quiet, ultra-compact, near-vertical takeoff and landing personal flying devices capable of flying 20 miles while carrying a single person. The competition began in September 2017 and will continue through February 1, 2020, when a final fly-off will determine a winner. The grand prize for the device with the best fly-off score is $1 million. Prizes will also be awarded to the quietest entry, the smallest entry, and the most disruptive design. From flyingmag.com, Safe Session addresses initial CFI applicant weaknesses. Doug Stewart, the Society of Flight Educators, or SAFE Executive Director Emeritus, hosted an online forum at last month's Sun and Fun at Lakeland, Florida, to discuss the kind of problems he sees with new flight instructor applicants. He was joined by two other DPEs, Mike Garrison and Bill Zeisnitz. The trio hoped the tips they offered might help stem the tide of pilots busting their initial CFI check rides. Garrison's had a huge problem as applicants arriving for their test who aren't really prepared. Quote, I've had applicants show up without having passed the knowledge test or having the proper 8710 application correctly filled out, he said. These two components are absolutely elementary. Garrison mentioned, too, that he often sees weaknesses in flight instructor candidates' ability to program the GPS in their aircraft, something he attributes to the weakness in that area of the applicant's own CFI. Another big weakness is effectively understanding risk management and the ability to teach to the Airman Certification Standards, or ACS. Zeisnitz pointed to the fundamental weaknesses in CFI applicants focused around their lack of in-depth understanding of aerodynamics. He also said the initial CFI ride is the most important test because a poorly prepared instructor is going to create poorly prepared pilots. Stewart spoke to a unique experience with a CFI applicant recently whom he asked to explain P-factor. He told me that P-factor was caused when the descending propeller blade moved faster than the ascending blade. Scratching his head, Stewart dove in closer to try and figure out where the applicant had learned such a thing. The answer was simple. Quote, he said, he told me he learned this from a YouTube video. He also questioned why many instructor applicants are earning their CFI in the first place to build hours to qualify for their ATP certificate. We'll include a link to this in the show notes. It's a 25-minute video. Anybody who's interested in becoming a flight instructor could probably benefit by watching it. From aeronews.net, men without pilot certificates steal and crash an airplane, and you can imagine the result was not good. Two fatally injured when a Blanca 17-30A impacted terrain about 75 yards from the runway. Two men, neither of whom were licensed, were fatally injured last week when the Blanca 17-30A Viking they had taken from Henderson City County Airport impacted terrain about 75 yards from the runway where they had taken off. The two were identified as Barry Hill, 47, and George Tucker, 48, both from Sanford, North Carolina. Kentucky State Police said they did not have permission to take the airplane. NBC News reports that one of the men knows the airplane's owner, and at least one had taken some flight instruction. The incident reportedly occurred after the airport closed for the day at 11 p.m. Kentucky State Police Trooper Corey King told NBC that it was not immediately clear which of the men knew the Blanca's owner and which was actually flying the plane when it went down. Right now, there are more questions than we have answers. And from kveo.com, men arrested for using helicopter to hunt and kill exotic animals in South Texas. A rancher and a pilot are among 4 men sentenced to 1 year of probation and fined for a 2017 South Texas trip using a helicopter to hunt and kill exotic animals. A federal judge in Laredo on Wednesday sentenced 36-year-old Cody Morgenthaler of Oklahoma and 3 men from Laredo, 33-year-old Edelmiro Martinez, 39-year-old Eduardo Lopez, and 56-year-old Inocente Sanchez. Prosecutors said Martinez owned Laredo Hunting Resort, Sanchez flies helicopters, and Lopez helped organize the $12,000 hunt in which Morgenthaler killed 4 antelope and sheep on the ground and from the air. All pleaded guilty to violating federal law that bans using aircraft to shoot animals for sport or trophy hunting. 3 of the men were fined $5,000 and the pilot was fined $2,500. Now, you might think that's an unusual story, but in the same week we have this story from aeronews.net, Idaho man charged for using a helicopter for hunting. Charges have been filed against Idaho Falls businessman Doyle Beck for allegedly using a helicopter for hunting. The Post-Register newspaper reports that Beck and 2 other men allegedly used the aircraft in September to retrieve a dead elk from the 18-mile wilderness area. Bureau of Land Management spokesperson Sarah Wheeler said the case did not involve anyone shooting from the aircraft, but the operation of motorized vehicles is not allowed in the area. Landing in such an area carries a possible fine of up to $100,000 and a year in prison. Beck has been charged with the unlawful use of a helicopter in hunting game. That charge carries a 6-month prison sentence. He's also charged with aiding in a misdemeanor, which can result up to a year in jail. He has pleaded innocent to both charges and demanded a jury trial. The charges against the person he allegedly assisted in the misdemeanor have been dropped by authorities. That person was charged with unlawful use of a helicopter in hunting game. That case was dismissed in March. And finally, a rather unusual story from aeronews.net. A California man reunited with prosthetic leg lost during skydive. Someone made an unusual discovery in a lumberyard in Cloverdale, California. A prosthetic leg fitted with a tennis shoe was found on the ground at the business. The Press Democrat newspaper reports that it turns out the leg belonged to 39-year-old Dion Calloway, who lost it while skydiving. Perhaps ironically, Calloway lost his real leg in a skydiving accident 2 years ago. He shattered his ankle attempting a high-speed landing, and while he was recovering, he could not skydive. But the damage was too extensive to allow him to jump again, and he elected to have the leg amputated so he could once again pursue his hobby. Calloway said he knew the leg had come loose when a rush of air got inside the prosthesis and it just flew off. He told the paper that he tried to watch where it was falling, but he had jumped from 10,000 feet and said he was so overwhelmed he couldn't keep track. Calloway is a regular jumper with NorCal Skydiving. He and others from the business searched nearby vineyards and other properties in an effort to locate the leg, but could not find it. So Calloway was understandably pleased when he got a call from Sonoma County Sheriff's Department on Monday telling him it had located the leg at the lumber yard. Calloway was reunited with his leg through its serial number. He said that it was in perfect shape despite its fall from 10,000 feet. And I imagine he's probably added one new item to his checklist whenever he goes skydiving. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates, and then we'll go to our main topic about 12 steps for handling an engine failure in flight. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. In a few minutes, we'll get to our main topic, but first, let me give you a few quick updates. Now, if you're a new listener and you're hearing the show for the first time and you'd like to get new shows downloaded every week for free, that's really easy. Just go to your smartphone, find the podcast, and click on subscribe. Doesn't mean you pay anything. It just means you get the shows downloaded for free each week. So thanks for joining us. And let's see, if you happen to be a student pilot or you're thinking about taking flying lessons in the future, you might be real interested in an article that appeared in the May 2019 issue of Flying Magazine. It's called A Practical Guide for Learning to Fly. It was written by Rob Mark. Many of you know him as one of the former co-hosts on the Airplane Geeks podcast that I'm on every week. And he interviewed several flight instructors, including me. And I've got some quotes here in the article. There's also a photograph of me. And I'm in the same page with Doug Stewart, who I just talked about earlier, who's the former executive director of SAFE. And Doug was the 2004 National Flight Instructor of the Year. A really good friend of mine. So check that out. That's in May 2019 of Flying Magazine. Now, I saw an article from AOPA that says the second anniversary of Basic Med has just occurred. Of course, that's the alternate way to get a medical for flying aircraft here in the United States. There are a number of limitations, including you can't fly above 18,000 feet. Now, I said back in episode number 105 that there were about 46,000 people using Basic Med, which is correct, but that I said that was about a quarter of the pilots in the United States. And I realized later, oops, I was thinking that would be about a quarter of the 200,000 airplanes here in the United States. So I think that's why I mentally divided 46,000 and came up with 25%. In fact, there are actually around 600,000 pilots in the U.S., so 46,000 pilots using Basic Med actually represents about 8% of the pilot population. Now, I haven't heard a lot of feedback from listeners about Basic Med, so if you got any stories about your experience getting Basic Med, just send me an email, and we'll share some of those in the future. I also want to mention that I've got a series of seminars coming up here over the next few weeks. This is my So You Want to Learn to Fly or Buy a Cirrus seminar. If you're in Northern California, it's going to be given in Palo Alto, San Carlos, and Sacramento Executive Airport on May 8th, 15th, and 23rd, respectively. The Palo Alto and San Carlos locations are going to be at the West Valley Flying Club at 7:30 p.m. The May 23rd date in Sacramento Executive is going to be in the main terminal building in the suite there. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email. And of course, if you're interested in the online version of this course, which I don't have out yet, just send me an email and I'll let you know as soon as it becomes available. Of course, the easiest way to get an email to me is go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. And I almost forgot to mention, I'm going to be presenting at the AOPA's Regional Fly-In in Frederick, Maryland this coming weekend. That's going to be Friday and Saturday, May 10th and May 11th. My presentation is a 3-hour seminar on advanced IFR. That's going to be on Saturday morning, I believe, at 9 o'clock. And I'll probably have a meetup for folks that want to get together on Friday evening, fans of the show. And if you are interested in meeting up, if you're going to be in Frederick, send me an email and I'll send you a note when I figure out where we're going to hold that again, probably on Friday the 10th at Frederick, Maryland. Now, I wanted to mention I had an interesting incident a couple of weeks ago with a fuel cap. My first time in 40 years having a fuel cap incident, but I think it was because I changed a routine. Let me tell you what happened. I was flying with a student in a Cirrus SR20, and he was going to be checking the fuel, and so I happened to take the fuel cap off, look inside to see what the fuel level was, and I thought I had replaced it because I know that I was the last one to touch that fuel cap, as when he dumped fuel back into the airplane, he did it on the other side of the airplane. However, when we came back from our flight, the fuel cap that I had inspected was gone. And so I'm thinking maybe I didn't go ahead and turn the tab and close it. I may have just inserted the fuel cap into the tank and just left it there, thinking perhaps that I was making it easier for him, saving him a little bit of time when he came to dump fuel into the aircraft. So that was a change in my routine, if indeed that's what happened. So I'm going to make sure I never do that again. Anytime I touch a fuel cap, it's going to be closed when I'm done dealing with it. And I've got to say, over the years, when I've had minor little incidents of different kinds, usually I can trace it back to either some kind of distraction or some kind of change in the routine. So you may want to consider changes in routine or distractions as red flags. And whenever those occur, you might want to be thinking real carefully about the impact of things that you may have done differently. Now, here's a message that I got from Warren in New Zealand via Facebook Messenger. He says, Max, I love listening to your podcast, but the latest one, episode 106 about VFR flying into IMC, says error downloading media. I've tried everything, but it won't work. Any tips for me, please? I have an iPhone and the Aviation News Talk app. And I sent a note back, and I said, I run into this a few times on different podcast apps. I said, on rare occasions when this happens, I delete the episode. And then after that, I just refresh the feed. So on most podcast apps, you put your finger on the screen, drag your finger toward the bottom of the screen, release your finger. It should then go out and try and download episode 106 again. And if it doesn't, try dragging your finger down again. And Warren wrote back to me and said, yep, that solved the problem. So again, this is pretty rare. I don't see it very often, but I thought I would mention that for anybody else who runs into this issue, regardless of what podcast app you might be using. And speaking of podcast, Edison Research came out with some new information here in the last week or so. They said the audience for podcasting grew significantly in the past year. They say that 51% of Americans aged 12 and older have ever listened to a podcast, and 32% have listened in the past month, and 22% have listened in the past week. So podcasting is growing, and of course, one way we grow is by letting new people know how to find the show. So definitely tell your friends about podcasting and how to get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And I had an email from ForeFlight, which came in, and they say big changes have arrived to the Documents feature on ForeFlight. They say the new Documents interface makes it easier to download and access documents and search for documents from anywhere in the app using their unified app search feature. Support includes nested folders in Cloud Documents, and they say you can access your documents from any device with support for documents on the iPhone, providing even more flexibility. And finally, they say your documents and all associated information are now included in ForeFlight's sync system, and apparently that allows you to move information back and forth between devices and allow you to back up your imported documents to the ForeFlight cloud. So if you're not familiar with that feature, you may want to check it out on the latest version of ForeFlight. And I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Gene Woods and the Schaumburg Flying Club in Illinois. Gene sent me a note. He said that they have an equity partnership with two Cessnas, a Cessna 172 and a 182S. He said that we recently upgraded our panels with complete Garmin products, including the GTN 650 dual G5s. And of course, the G5 is the electronic flight instrument that's a direct replacement for a round gauge attitude indicator. And we talked about it way back in episode 14 when we interviewed Garmin software engineer Joe Epner, who helped design the G5. He also says that they've got new audio panels and a transponder with ADS-B in and out capability and more. So it sounds like Gene and the Schaumburg Flying Club have a great club going there, and we're happy to hear that they also listen to the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let me briefly mention our Patreon site. If you are enjoying the show and you find value in it, well, we can offer you a few little extra goodies if you choose to support the show. $4 a month supporters get copies of the scripts for our new shows, and the $8 a month supporters get the scripts plus a list of links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news. And there were 16 of those stories this week that didn't get included because of time constraints. Now, we've got a number of new supporters, and they include Gerald Smith, Victor Vogel, who's a new super supporter, Dennis Pillarinos, he's edited his pledge up to $8 a month, Terry Scoggins, Brian Deere, who edited his pledge up to $20 a month, making him a super supporter, Skip Caddy, Ralph P., Gene Woods, and Olivier Farine, who also edited his pledge up to $4 a month. And I really want to thank all of you for your contributions and thank everyone who helps support the show in any way, whether it's sending feedback or leaving a review on your podcast app or sending us questions. Thanks so much. And please, of course, tell all your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And in just a minute, we'll be talking about 12 steps for handling an engine failure in flight, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Let's talk now about the 12 steps for handling an engine failure in flight. And by that, I mean an engine failure that either occurs during the cruise phase of flight or maybe in the descent and approach to an airport. So we're excluding a takeoff engine failure that occurs close to the ground soon after takeoff. And we previously talked about some aspects of a takeoff engine failure in episode 68, 10 Things to Know About the Impossible Turn After a Takeoff Engine Failure Emergency. So if you haven't heard that episode, you may want to check it out. And you can find that episode on the web by going to aviationnewstalk.com/68. Now, I was thinking about this topic because I was out last week teaching these procedures to a student pilot. And I should mention the procedures that I'll describe here are generic and they may be slightly different for your aircraft. So please don't use this podcast as a substitute for flight instruction, and do use the procedures for your airplane in preference to anything I talk about in any episode of the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now, when we talk about engine failures, it's important to note that engine problems are not always a complete stoppage of the engine. Often it's a problem that creates some reduction in engine power, which you might notice as either a low RPM or manifold pressure, or frequently as a roughness of the engine. But you should probably treat any of these partial engine failures just as seriously as a complete engine failure, because with a loss of some engine power, there's no guarantee the engine will remain at that reduced power level forever. Quite likely, things will get progressively worse over time, so you should get on the ground as quickly as possible. Now, my wild guess is that partial engine failures are far more common than complete engine failures. Now, granted, that's just my opinion based on anecdotal evidence, which is my own personal experience over about 10,000 hours of flying general aviation aircraft. Now, I don't want to jinx anything by saying this, but to date, I've never had a complete engine failure. But I've personally known multiple people who've had complete engine failures, and I've had a couple of instances where an engine wouldn't put out full power. One of those occurred while on a training flight in which I was flying years ago on a Cessna 172 with a student pilot. And in that case, we'd been flying for quite a while and everything was fine, but at some point, I noticed that the engine wouldn't put out full power. I don't remember the exact amount of RPM we were getting, but it was somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 RPM versus full power, which would have been around 2,500 RPM. And I remember thinking, well, I have plenty of power to maintain altitude and get back to my home airport, which at the time was Reed Hillview Airport in San Jose, which was maybe 12 to 13 miles away. But the South County Airport was only just 5 to 6 miles behind me, so I had a decision to make. Now, today, that decision would be easy for me. Get to the closest airport immediately and land. But at the time, I was tempted to continue on to my home airport. Here was my thought process. If I were to continue northbound, eventually I would end up over Holmes, and I would be in a much worse position to land if the engine quit. And since my student pilot happened to be a lawyer, there's a good chance that I would get sued. So I made a U-turn and landed at the South County Airport. Today, I would have made the same decision regardless of who was on board the aircraft. But I was lucky that my student was a lawyer, as it really crystallized my thinking as to what I should do. Well, after landing, we found a mechanic, and we spent about an hour examining the engine and running it up, but we were unable to duplicate the problem. So I talked with a mechanic at our home airport, and he cleared us to bring the aircraft home, and we had full power in flight. But when we got the airplane home, he couldn't find a problem with it, and he left it on the flight line for rent. So I told all of my clients to not rent that airplane anymore, and within a few months, that aircraft got a new engine, presumably because the problem reappeared. Now, I've had two other instances where I didn't have full engine power, both in Cessnas, and both many years ago. One was over 30 years ago when taking off from Hackettstown, New Jersey airport with my friend Charlie Rothschild, who now lives just a few miles away from me here in California and owns a Cessna 182 with a partner. During our takeoff roll, the airplane wasn't putting out full power, so we aborted the takeoff and taxied back to the beginning of the runway. We then did another takeoff in which we had full power, and our flight was uneventful. Now, if that happened to me today, I probably wouldn't have made a second takeoff attempt and would have brought the aircraft back for a mechanic to look at it. And about 18 years ago, soon after I got my CFI, I took a young lady on her first intro flight from San Jose International Airport. We had only climbed out to perhaps maybe 2,000 feet when we had a partial reduction in engine power. Well, I made a U-turn and was back on the ground in probably 5 minutes. I don't think she continued taking flying lessons, but I think she may be a listener to this podcast, in which case I want to say, Jennifer, that was certainly a memorable flight for both of us, and I'm glad it worked out okay. But let's talk about how frequently engine failures do occur. Robert Wright, who used to head up the GA and commercial division of the FAA, wrote an article last year in Aviation Safety magazine called The Real Risk of Engine Failures. Now, that article is behind a paywall, but a version of the same article appeared on avweb.com last month, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. In it, Robert wrote, in 2015, mechanical reasons were ascribed to 15.7% of non-commercial fixed-wing accidents, earning them a distant second behind the pilot-related category. Of them, 82, which was 54%, involved the power plant. Only 9, which was 11% of the power plant failures during 2015, were fatal, meaning we basically have a 9 in 10 chance to survive an accident resulting from an engine failure. So that's 82 engine failures in a single year. I don't know if that sounds like a large number to you, but you should know that the actual number of engine failures has to be much larger than 82 per year. And that's because many engine failures don't result in an accident because the pilot gets the aircraft safely to the ground. And most of those engine failures go unreported, meaning the actual number of engine failures is much larger than 82 per year, but how much larger is unknown. Now, there are some things you can do in advance to mitigate the consequences of engine failure that you might have on a flight. One is route planning. Years ago, I used to fly volunteer doctors and dentists to Mexico, and I would fly the most direct route to the Van Nuys VOR, which was the starting point for a VFR corridor through the Los Angeles Class Bravo airspace. But for about 10 minutes, that route took me over a heavily forested area with few places to land if I had an engine failure. So after looking at the sectional map, I later started flying a route that placed me over Interstate 5 for much of the trip, which I fondly refer to as the world's longest emergency landing strip. And even if I chose not to land on the highway due to traffic, in most cases there were large fields adjacent to the interstate where, if I did land, I would be noticed by passing traffic. And another important thing is you are always required by the FARs to brief your passengers before a flight on how to open the door and exit the aircraft. And having that knowledge could be critical if you have an engine failure in an off-airport landing, so you want to make sure you do that before every flight. Now let's talk about the signs of impending engine failure. You've probably heard that dropping oil pressure and rising oil temperature are warning signs. And in an episode of the Finer Points podcast, Jason Miller said that he once landed a Cessna 182 that had lost 5 quarts of oil in flight, and he landed with just 2 quarts of oil. Yet he saw no changes in the oil temperature and pressure gauges before landing. And Mike Bush has written in one of his articles that engine monitor data that he's looked at for Cirrus aircraft shows no rise in oil temperature when oil pressure falls. And in episode 103 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, Ed Regensburg, the pilot who pulled a Cirrus parachute over the Caribbean, said that he had only just a few minutes from the first low oil pressure warning to the engine seizing and stopping. So my conclusion is that by the time you get a warning that your engine may be failing, you may have only a few minutes left to get the aircraft on the ground at a location of your choosing versus a random location when the engine does quit. If you do have engine problems, don't panic. Take a moment to take a deep breath. Air Force pilots used to say that the first step in an emergency is to wind the clock, which meant that you should do something routine for a moment so that you don't let yourself panic. This is meant to help you realize that you do have time to deal with the emergency and you don't have to instantly react, perhaps in ways that make the situation worse. There have been countless accidents caused by pilots reacting instantly and incorrectly to a problem. For example, multi-engine pilots who've had an engine failure will sometimes rush to feather the prop on the bad engine, but will mistakenly shut down the good engine. And some pilots who panicked when a door opens in flight have been so distracted with trying to close the door that they've crashed. So step number 1 in an emergency is don't panic, wind the clock. Step 2 is to immediately turn toward an airport or other suitable landing area at the first sign of engine trouble. Don't spend lots of time troubleshooting in the air while bypassing perfectly good airports where you could be troubleshooting on the ground instead. Remember, if you have some problem with the engine that reduces power, don't assume that it will stay at that reduced power level forever. More than likely, it's going to get worse, so assume the worst and get the aircraft on the ground as soon as possible. And stay high. If you're approaching the airport on a normal 3-degree glide slope and the engine quits, you won't make it to the airport. Remember, too, that you can't glide an equal distance in any direction due to the wind, so it's possible that you might not reach the nearest field if you're gliding into a headwind, but you might be able to reach an airport that's further away if there's a tailwind to help you get there. Now let's talk about what makes a suitable landing area. Obviously, an airport is best, but not all airports are equal. Some are narrow, some are short, many are paved, and any of these items could make the airport less than ideal. So if the nearest airport is less than optimal, you'll need to decide whether to land there or at a better airport that's further away, and that you might not make it to if the engine fails before you get to. It's a tough decision, but I would tend to err on the side of getting on the ground as soon as possible before you do have a complete engine failure. If you can't make it to an airport, the first thing that pilots immediately jump to is a road, since most are paved, and in that regard they resemble airports. But unlike airports, virtually every road has electrical wires running along the side of it, because roads lead to man-made objects, and almost all man-made structures need electricity. Hence, even the smallest roads in the most remote areas will still have wires running along them. So in some cases, you'll be better off landing in a field rather than on a narrow road with wires running along it. And if you do land in a field and it's plowed, you want to land parallel with the furrows. If you land against the furrows, there's a good chance the aircraft will flip over and that you'll be injured. Also, if there's any slope to the ground you're landing on, definitely try to land uphill, as this will considerably shorten your landing distance. Of course, if you do land on a road, you want to make sure that the traffic on it is light enough that you're nearly positive that you won't hit a car. Because when an engine fails, well, that's bad luck for you, but you don't want to share your misery with innocent people on the ground who might get injured by your choices. Years ago, we had a plane land on a busy San Francisco Bay Area road, and the propeller chopped into the side of a car, cutting the leg of a child in the car. And pilots do a remarkable job. We have probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 fatal aircraft accidents a year, and generally only a couple people on the ground die from all of these accidents. And that's in part because pilots make choices, sometimes tough choices, to avoid landing an airplane where it might injure innocent people on the ground. Now, don't try to land at the beginning of a field, as fields are almost always surrounded by wires. And if you're aiming for a runway, try to aim for a point that's about a third of the way down the runway so that you don't come up short of the runway. As you may have heard before, it's far better to run through the fence at the end of the runway at 20 knots than to come up short of the runway and hit something at 60 knots. And regardless of where you land, you should land into the wind if possible. That's because even small differences in touchdown speed can have a big impact on survivability. Consider this. Force is a function of the square of the speed. So if you're traveling twice as fast when you hit something, it's going to hurt 4 times as much. Imagine that you're landing at 60 miles an hour and there's a 20 mile per hour wind. If you land into the wind, you'll touch down at 40 miles an hour. But if you land with a tailwind, you'll be touching down at 80 miles an hour. And if you hit something, you'll hit it 4 times as hard. So you want to get good at determining the winds, either by listening to an ATIS, looking at the winds aloft if you have a Cirrus XM subscription, or by looking at the movement of trees, blowing dust or smoke, or other clues. Now, you may wonder why Cirrus pilots would choose to pull the parachute when there's a perfectly good field below them. And the answer is rather simple. They have a better chance of survival when they pull the parachute. Landing speed for a Cirrus SR20 is 75 knots, but if you pull the parachute, you'll be coming down at 15 knots, or about 1/5 the speed. So since the landing speed is 5 times greater, that means if you hit anything while landing, the forces will be 25 times greater, because of course it's the square of 5. Imagine what it would feel like if someone were to punch you hard in the shoulder. Now imagine what it would feel like to get hit 25 times harder. Now you understand why a Cirrus pilot would rather come down under parachute than risk hitting a hole or stump in a field and flipping over. There have been numerous cases where a Cirrus pilot has ridden their plane to the ground only to die on the ground when they almost certainly would have survived without injuries if they'd pulled the parachute at a safe altitude. Step number 3, when the engine eventually quits, immediately get to the aircraft's best glide speed. If the engine failure occurs during takeoff, you'll need to push hard on the yoke or stick to get to best glide. But if you're in cruise when the engine quits, you're going to initially need to pull on the yoke or stick to get to best glide speed. Then trim the aircraft so that it stays at the best glide speed. Remember that the best glide speed is specified at the maximum gross weight, and the best glide speed decreases for lower aircraft weights. And so, unless you took off over gross weight, your aircraft will always be at less than max gross weight when the engine quits, so you should be flying at a speed that's less than the specified best glide speed. Some manufacturers will specify best glide speed at 2 different weights, which will help you pick a speed. Or, if your best glide speed is only specified at max gross weight, I have read a rule of thumb which says that you can decrease the best glide speed by 2% for every 100 pounds your aircraft is below max gross weight. Step number 4, clean up your airplane. The flaps and landing gear should be retracted and cowl flaps closed. With a constant speed prop, you should immediately pull back the prop control all the way out so that the prop blades present less wind resistance. Doing this can have a dramatic effect and cut your descent rate in half. Of course, if you've lost all oil pressure, you won't be able to control the propeller blade angle, as the prop governor uses oil pressure to change the prop blade angle. Step number 5 is to memorize the first few steps of the engine out procedure, but don't try and do the entire procedure from memory. Instead, use a checklist for backup. I remember flying once with an excellent CFI who did the engine out checklist completely from memory, and he still missed a step. That was when he was relaxed in a training environment. Imagine how much more difficult it would be to remember everything when the engine quits for real and you're feeling stressed. So memorize at least the first few steps of the engine out checklist, and after completing it, review the checklist to make sure you didn't miss anything. Better yet, figure out a flow pattern, which is a path your hand can move around the cockpit that takes you over all the critical controls. For example, on a Cessna 172, I follow an L-shaped pattern. I drop my hand to the floor by the fuel selector valve and check it. Then I check everything as my hand moves straight up to the mixture control and then move all the way to the left of the mag switch. After completing a flow check in which I've checked all the things my hands passed over, I pull out the checklist to verify that I didn't miss anything. And you may want to create your own checklist. For example, I found that some of the electronic checklist and glass cockpit aircraft take way too long to bring up on the screen, and some of them require you to do the slow selection process twice to bring up 2 different checklists, one for troubleshooting and another for landing with a failed engine. For Cessnas, I particularly like the checklists that are made by Checkmate, which come on a single plastic card. The engine out procedures are on the back of that card, and they're much faster to access than electronic checklists. Step number 6, troubleshoot the 3 things your engine needs to operate: fuel, spark, and air. To do that, well, I would use a flow pattern, like the one I just described before for a Cessna 172. Now, in an aircraft with carb heat, at the very first signs of decreasing RPM, I would turn on the carb heat. Note that this is only effective when the engine is still running and generating some heat, so don't wait until after the engine quits to turn on the carb heat, because there's no heat left. There are lots of accidents that occur every year due to carburetor ice, and we'll be talking about carb ice and carb heat in a future show. Now, in a Cirrus, I also use an L-shaped pattern similar to the one I use on a 172. I'd start with my hand at the back of the center console where the fuel tank selector is located and move my hand forward to the flap switch. It may be wise to change the position of the fuel selector valve even though the fuel gauge indicates fuel in all tanks, because fuel gauges can be inaccurate. I then checked to see if the boost pump was on and that the mixture was full rich. Later, if my troubleshooting didn't solve the problem, I'd come back to see if moving the boost pump to the high position or moving the mixture knob to a different position might solve the problem. From the flap switch, I'd go up the center console and then move all the way left to the magneto key. I checked to see that it was still in the both position, and I'd probably turn the key to the L and the R positions to see if that might help. Finally, I'd turn the key to the start position to see if I could restart the engine. The flow over which you move your hand may be different in your aircraft, but you'll probably be checking many of these same items. Normally, I wouldn't have to do anything to check the air flowing into the engine, but if I were in snow or ice, I would be concerned that the air filter may have been packed in with snow or ice, blocking the airflow to the engine. In most Cessnas, the alternate air door is automatic, so there's nothing to do. But in many aircraft like the Cirrus, you have to pull the alternate air knob, which bypasses the filter and lets unfiltered air into the engine. Note, you don't want to confuse the alternate air knob with the alternate static air knob. They sound similar, but they're very different. The alternate air knob controls air going into your engine, while the alternate static air knob feeds your airspeed altimeter and vertical speed indicators and lets you choose a different source of static air if the static port on the outside of the aircraft is blocked. Now, if you don't succeed in restarting the engine, step number 7 is communicate. If you're already talking with ATC, when you first notice that you have engine trouble, advise them that you'd like a vector to the closest airport and land. And if you're not talking with ATC, squawk 7700 and give a Mayday call on 121.5. Even if you're in a remote area, most likely an airliner will hear you and pass on information about your situation and your location. Step number 8 is to use good crew resource management. If you have another pilot on board or someone who's good at working the radio, you can delegate all of the radio communications to him or her while you continue to troubleshoot and fly the airplane. Also, ask any other pilots on board whether there's anything else that he or she can think of to deal with your current situation. 2 brains are better than 1, so use good crew resource management to involve everyone who can help in dividing the workload and helping to solve the problem. Step number 9, if you're unable to start the engine, shut down everything related to fuel and electricity except the master switch if you need electricity to lower your flaps before touchdown. The reason you want to shut off everything related to the fuel and anything that could spark is that those 2 elements are all you need to start a fire after you land. So you want to do everything you can do prior to touchdown to eliminate the possibility of a fire. For the fuel, pull the mixture control to idle and turn the fuel valve to the off position. In newer Cessnas built since 1997, you'll need to pull out the fuel shutoff valve as it's now separate from the fuel selector switch. Then turn off everything related to electricity and spark. So turn off the magneto key to the off position. If you have manual flaps, turn off the battery master switch. If you have electric flaps, wait until you've lowered the flaps before turning off the master switch. Step number 10, have a strategy for managing your descent. Otherwise, without a plan, you'll just be flying around in random directions, hoping that you'll be at the right altitude when you finally turn toward the field or runway to land. Most books tell you to fly to the key position, which is a position on downwind abeam the numbers, where you typically begin a normal landing by pulling power and adding flaps. They then suggest that you circle down over that position until you're at traffic pattern altitude, at which point you can fly the same type of pattern that you would fly for a power-off landing. Now, that's the way I was taught by my primary instructor, but I've always thought that this method has a major flaw, and that is, as you circle down, there's only one point in a 360-degree turn at which you'll be pointed in the right direction to start the landing. But since you may lose 400 to 500 feet in every circle over the key position, you're likely to end up as much as a couple hundred feet high in the traffic pattern, or maybe a couple hundred feet low when you come out of your circle and are pointed on downwind and begin to land. Now, the benefit of this method, however, is that if you've consistently practiced power-off landings, then you should have no problem judging your height as you fly an abbreviated pattern to get to the runway. Of course, if you're at a towered airport like the one where I fly all the time, well, we're often number 3 or number 4 to the field, and we rarely get to fly a power-off approach, as we're often flying a couple miles past the airport on long downwinds so that we can follow the aircraft in front of us. When I was learning to become a CFI, my instructor, John, taught me another method which I've always liked. He suggested that I fly a series of figure eights back and forth across the extended center line of the runway at a point that's perhaps a mile from the runway. Now, the beauty of this is that there are multiple times within a figure eight where you can turn toward the runway because you judge that you're at the proper altitude. Contrast that with flying a circle over the key position where there's only one point in a 360-degree turn when you can begin your power-off landing. Also, if you fly figure eights, you're never going to be pointed completely away from the runway, so you should be able to keep the airport in sight throughout the entire maneuver. Of course, like any maneuver, you want to practice it in advance so that you can fly it well if your engine quits for real. Regardless of what method you use to bleed off altitude, when you are completely sure that you'll make it to the airport, lower your flaps and shut off your master switch. Step number 11 is to open the doors while you're still in the air. That's because after you land, any impact could jam the doors so that you can't get them open. In episode 103, Cirrus pilot Ed Regensburg told us that he opened his door before hitting the water, but his passenger didn't, and that door became jammed and wouldn't open after they hit the water. Don't worry that it will somehow be unsafe to open the doors in flight before touchdown. In most aircraft, the doors will only stay open an inch or less in flight, which isn't dangerous. Now, there's only one aircraft I know where an open door can cause a problem, and that's the Columbia 350 and 400, now known as the Cessna Corvallis TTX. There were at least 2 cases I know of where doors on these aircraft were not properly latched on the ground, and they tore off the aircraft in flight. Step number 12 is to use any automation tools that you have available to you. For example, if you use ForeFlight on an iPhone or iPad, you might want to use its Glide Advisor feature. To use it, you'll need to enable Glide Advisor in the Map Settings menu, then enter your aircraft's glide ratio and best glide speed in the Glide Settings field under Glide Performance. Later, when you're flying, Glide Advisor will put a line around your aircraft showing how far you can glide in any direction. And here's a trick that I learned while getting my Cirrus Vision Jet type rating last fall. If the engine quits and you have an autopilot with an IAS or FLC mode, engage the autopilot with either of these modes and dial in the best glide speed on the autopilot. The autopilot will then keep you at best glide speed throughout your descent. Many Garmin glass cockpits can display a selected altitude intercept arc. That's a light blue curved line that appears on the moving map that shows you where you'll be on the map when you reach the altitude that's currently set with the altitude selector knobs. Now, airline pilots sometimes call this the banana bar. So if you're gliding to an airport, enter the field elevation with the altitude selector knobs, then look on the map and see whether the banana bar is between you and the airport or if it's beyond the airport. If it's beyond the airport, that means you will make it to the airport. But if the banana bar is between you and the airport, it shows where you'll be when you come up short of the airport. Finally, if you're flying with a Garmin GPS with a nearest button, you can most likely set a criteria for the minimum airport length to be used when displaying the nearest airports. You'll probably want to set that number so it's relatively small. That way you'll see more airports, even if some of them are short, because it's far better to run off the end of a short runway than to not even know the airport is there and land in a really bad field or in the trees. Well, there you have it, 12 steps for managing an engine failure in flight. Coming up next, listener feedback and questions, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's look at some listener feedback. Here's an email from Paul in Texas. He says, "Hi, Max. I finally caught up on episode 85 when you talked about flying in Australia. I had a similar experience when I lived in Singapore and did some flying with the Republic of Singapore Flying Club. One of the most interesting things I learned is that Class A airspace doesn't start at 18,000 feet MSL everywhere in the world. The transition altitude over Singapore itself is 13,000 feet, about 11,000 feet in the greater region." He says, "Thanks for the work you did in Aviation News Talk podcast. I learned something new with each episode." Well, thanks so much for your email, Paul. And yes, I think in Europe, there's even lower Class A, some as low as 3,000 and 6,000 feet, depending on the country that you're in. Here's an email from Charles. He says, "Regarding the 8 lessons episode, I was skeptical about what could be added to what I had already heard about the 737 MAX crashes. But after listening to the podcast, I was impressed by the steps offered that each pilot should do as a result of 737 MAX crashes. I think they are superb suggestions." Well, thanks so much. Appreciate that. And here's an email from Barry in New Jersey. I love the way he addresses me. He says, "Mr. T, I just finished episode 100. And Barry, I should mention, by the way, there's a big difference between Mr. T and me. And that is, I wear fewer gold chains. But anyway, he says, "I just finished episode 100 and had a thought on the question of whether or not there would be a stall warning prior to a base to final stall spin. Typically, small GA aircraft have only a single stall warning sensor on one wing. Since only one wing stalls during a base to final stall spin, that means I think that there would be no chance of a stall warning if the stalled wing was the one without the stall warning sensor. That would suggest for at least 50% of the incidents, there would be no chance of stall warning. Since left traffic predominates, that percentage might be lower if stall warning sensors were more likely to be installed on the left wing, or it would be higher if stall warning sensors were more likely installed on the right wing." And he notes on his Tiger that it's on the right wing. And I wrote back and said, "Yes, you raise an interesting point, which I never thought of before. It makes total sense. In a more recent episode, I mentioned the difference between a slipping stall and a skidding stall. And the skidding stall happens so quickly that there would really be zero time to recover at low altitude, even if the stall horn did come on." And here's an email from Gary. He says, "I'm happy to let you know that on April 29th, Dr. Tammy Shoulder earned her ATP type rating in an ERJ 170/190. She passed all her training at SkyWest without a hitch. It's amazing to think that on April 9th, 2018, Tammy was a brand new private pilot, and here she is a year later receiving her ATP and type rating. And I'm super proud of her. Thanks again for your interview with her during episode 80. It's been folks like you with your enthusiasm and encouragement that have helped Tammy along the way. We love your show and continue to learn from it every week. Well, congratulations. Another new airline pilot. So that's awesome. Here's an email from Steve. He says, you had asked listeners to provide input to stress management in emergency situations. One of the most important stress management tools I have learned to use is a breathing technique called box breathing. He says, I use this technique by imagining a box, and I use a 5 count to inhale, hold, exhale, hold, and repeat. This takes me 15 seconds. Focusing even momentarily on your breathing has several physiological benefits. And for me, I'm able to refocus far better when I assert control over my breathing. Lots of videos about this technique, and it's very simple to remember. Just the act of thinking about breathing is valuable in stress. Well, Steve, thanks so much for that. I will keep that in mind if I have an emergency at some point. And now let's go to listener questions. This comes from Greg. He says, I'm looking at making the transition you did to get more flying in my career. I've worked in aviation all my career as a dispatcher, but find myself in the headquarters swamp a little too far from operations. I think with 200 hours and 50 years, I am too old to get an airline spot. I expect around age 60, I would be hanging on to the bottom of the seniority list at a bad base. So I'm considering biz jets, charter work, or flight instructor. Finally, my question, how did you make the transition? Cold turkey or a fade from one to another? I'm single, so no other funds coming in. Is this a simple question or podcast idea? Either way, thanks for your perspective. Thanks for your question, Greg. I wrote back to him and I said, first, you're not too old to go to the airlines, but you would need to get 1,500 hours total time. And teaching as a CFI is one of the most common ways people get those hours. I'm not sure what minimum hours most corporate pilots would need to fly pistons. You could certainly do it with far fewer hours to fly corporate jets. Well, you're going to have to research how many hours corporate flight departments in your area are looking for when they hire. Now, there is right now a huge demand for CFIs, so I think you could quickly find a job once you had your private instrument, commercial, and CFI. And depending upon where you are, you could probably accrue 600 to 1,000 hours a year working as a CFI, so you'd reach the minimum hours for an airline job in 2 years or less as a working CFI. Now, I'd suggest not going cold turkey unless you have enough money in the bank to pay your expenses for a year or two. I'd suggest keeping your current job while you get your instrument, commercial, and CFI. And then you could either teach part-time while still working with your current job, which is what I did for 3 years, or quit your job and live off your income as a CFI. Hope that helps. Thanks so much for your question, Greg. And we do have a couple shows coming up here in the next few weeks which address the career question. So stay tuned for those. Here's an email from Mike down in Southern California. Now, I know Mike is an airline pilot. He said, I listened to your podcast the other day on the Boeing 737 MAX MCAS issue. Mostly very well done. I see a lot of press heading sometimes in the very wrong direction on that issue, but yours was very well done. The 8 takeaways you touch on were spot on for the GA crowd, and I'm going to be hitting those when I do training with folks. I wonder what you can tell me about the AOA issue with the SF-50 Vision Jet that spread all over the news today. Some folks are asking if it's the same AOA sensor manufacturing as the Boeing one, and I just don't know. And Mike, I mentioned that during the news. It is a separate manufacturer that I don't have that right here at my fingertips right now, but I know it's a different company. And here's an email from a Patreon supporter, Jerry. He says, Hi, Max. I love your podcast. It's my favorite by far. I have a unique problem that I hope you can help with. I'm considering buying an SR20, but my autistic son, who is 12 and not small in stature, can be impulsive. My concern is he might activate the caps from the back seat. I have similar concerns with respect to the rear doors of the Bonanza and the Cessna 206. I've Googled extensively, but haven't found a good solution for either. Do you have any suggestions, or am I best sticking with something like a Cessna 182? Well, I wrote back to him, and by the way, I had to think about this for a while. I said, I think you're wise to be thinking about this, as the rear doors and the caps could be serious, even life-threatening issues. My first thought was to stick with the Cessna 182, but then I realized there must be a reason you're interested in a Cirrus or a Bonanza. I'm guessing it's for the speed, as an SR22 wouldn't give you a useful load increase versus the 182. So I said, so if you're interested in a faster aircraft, you may want to go with the Cirrus, but disable the caps, perhaps with a zip tie securing the parachute handle in place. Perhaps there are ways to disable the doors in the Bonanza or the Cessna 206, but I think that would be difficult and probably greatly decrease safety if you ever had to make an off-airport landing. By contrast, in the SR-22, all of your doors would still function but couldn't be accessed from the rear seat. Now, initially, I didn't even think of disabling the caps, as I always assumed that everyone would want to have it available to improve safety. But if you're interested in the speed increase and are willing to forego the added safety from caps, which, by the way, you don't have in your Cessna 182 anyway, then I think that's a reasonable decision. Now, in that case, you might think about storing a cutting tool in the center console so that you could remove the zip tie if you did need to use the caps. Now, that would not work in all situations because the aircraft might be moving in a way that you just can't get to the handle with high Gs, but at least it would allow you to still use the caps in some situations. And I would add to that technically the aircraft may not be airworthy. You'd have to take a look at the manual, but I suspect that, a mechanic in the FAA might say that would not be an airworthy aircraft. So this would be up to you and your conscience as to what you might choose to do. And that actually provides a perfect segue, because if anyone listening is interested in buying a model of Cirrus airplane or jet, or they're interested in flight training in one, please call me today for free consultations. In some cases, I can arrange a free demo flight for you, and I'm happy to talk with you about the ins and outs of buying new versus used. Just call me at 650-967-2500, or go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the webpage. And you can also use that to leave any listener questions or give us any feedback. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please take a moment to show at least one of your aviation friends this week how he or she can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't really know what a podcast is, and as we know, half the people out there don't, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. It's just in the App Store, just like you look for any other app. Search for Aviation News Talk. And of course, the apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.